Good afternoon, friends, both here in the Memorial Room at Queen's and online. I'm sorry we're starting a few minutes late. We've had, as you can see, a slight technical hitch, but we hope that we've now overcome those technical hitches. We're here today to learn about and launch the project and website for the new Crafting Documents project. I am going to pass you over in a moment or two to the lead investigator of that, Professor Julia Smith from All Souls College, and she will introduce her colleagues, Anna Diaz from here in Oxford and Ira Rabin from Berlin. It's a fascinating project about the materiality of writing, and I can see from the old friends that I know well who are interested in exactly those things in the room that we're all going to be fascinated for the next hour or so. So first of all, I'll pass over to Julia and she'll introduce you.
Well, thank you very, very much for being here, and welcome, as Leslie said, both to those of you who are online and to everyone in the room. It's great to see such a good turnout. As I'll explain in a minute, we've been very busy behind the scenes for the last year. Exactly, the funding started on the 1st of February last year. So what we're wanting to do is introduce you to the website and all the workings behind the scene, but also outline how we got to where we are and what we're aiming to do and what some of the challenges and interests are in the road that we are journeying together as a team. And I'm going to speak first, and then my co-PI, Ira, will speak, and then Anna Diaz will speak, and then at about 3:20, the fourth member of the speaking team, Jose Andres Porras, will arrive. He's teaching, but he will come just as soon as he's finished teaching, and he will speak briefly last. So what I want to do first up is, oh, right, okay. Okay. Is explain about the genesis of this project. I can't get rid of that little thing at the top, and about a bit about how it works. This is funded by a grant under the joint scheme between the AHRC, now part of UKRI, and the Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft. It is not a single grant. It is two separate grants which dovetail completely together, but which were selected by a joint panel from both organizations meeting together. And they are, as you'll see in a minute, subject to very, very different parameters of what budgets will bear and so forth. This is an annual competition which has been running for several years. This is not the first one that the Humanities Division in Oxford has received. There's one that has been running in classics for a year longer than us. There's up to 3 years funding available for discovery-led and internationally significant research. And so Ira is my co-PI from the Federal Institute for Materials Research and Testing, which mostly is sort of chemists and jet engines and things like that, but has a small cultural assets division. Both funding bodies have committed to put an approximately equivalent amount into the scheme each year, and the current funding call is still open. If anyone wants to get something together for it, the closing date, I think, is in a few days' time, actually. Right, okay. So here you can see just how asymmetrical the grants are. We in Oxford have to conform to UKRI rules, which means that there's a very substantial slice of overheads built into the grant. £350,000 may sound quite a lot, but actually it doesn't buy you that much. The large majority of that goes on Anna's salary. There is an obligatory tiny amount of my salary built into it, and really not that much left by the time we've added in the overheads. There's money for travel, and there's the fees for the long-term open access data storage, which Jose will say something about in a minute. The Berlin side is very different. There were going to be salaries built in, but were taken out at the last minute. travel again to Berlin, subcontracting of some of the lab work that we're doing, and fees for open access publications. And Oliver, the co-I on the Berlin side, is with us online, but couldn't get over here. He's also head of the division and too busy in that role. You'll meet Jose shortly. I was sitting on a little slush fund, which I'd had for some years and needed to spend up. And Jose has been brilliant at cleaning up some old data sets of mine and working out the whole architecture of a database that's behind the scenes. And you will meet him very shortly. We're working very internationally. In the first place, right here, just over the garden wall from All Souls, we're very grateful to the Centre for Manuscript and Text Cultures based here, which is a cross-cultural centre as interested in Chinese as in classical manuscripts. We're also working in close relationship with the Materiale Textkulturen Sonderforschungsbereich cluster in the University of Heidelberg, who have got a sub-project on relic labels, which is a much more traditional philological editing, textual analysis, script description, and so forth project. We are subcontracting work, the proteomics of parchment analysis, which is the scientific test which tells you whether it's cow, sheep, goat, squirrel, whatever else, is being done by the Department of Archaeology in Cambridge for us. And we've recently established links with the Institut de Recherche et d'Histoire des Textes in Paris, who are going to do multispectral imaging for us of some completely otherwise illegible labels that we're dying to find out exactly what they say. So I want to say a bit about how we came to be doing this. Because I think it flies in the face of just about everything which certainly I had ever been told about how one goes about getting grants, which is in terms of going to one of these sort of speed dating things or just sort of ringing up the phone to somebody in your own university and saying, let's do it. My own long-term research interests, which I'll say a wee bit about at the moment, and long list of publications, and Ira has her own in her own field. So there's a long-term element, plus a lot of very short-term opportunism. We were put in touch with each other at 2 removes by 2 people in Warsaw, so it was very indirect in September 2020, and we had a Zoom meeting and exchanged research publications. The grant call was issued. We decided to go for it. I found that the other day, Ira, the email in which you got it first, and you emailed me and said, should we try for it? So I said, yeah, why not? And so we submitted an application. We heard in November 22, and you have to begin 3 months later. Now, Ira and I had never met except on Zoom. And our first face-to-face meeting was in May last year, when we had a project kickstarting meeting. So the short-term opportunism there was very much there around responding to the grant call. And then working really very hard to get the application together, really very hard and fast. A lot of serendipity is involved in terms of, these indirect links through Warsaw, and Brian Ward Perkins is somewhere in the room. Yes, you're over there. Warsaw, it's Robert Wiśniewski and then another colleague of his who is now in Berlin working in Ira's teams. So the sense of international networks that cumulatively take one from A to B to C is very much serendipitous. I wouldn't never have found my way to Ira and her work if it hadn't been for Brian, the Cult of Saints, and his colleague in Warsaw, Robert Wiśniewski. But lateral thinking in both Ira's part and mine in terms of thinking outside our own typical research trajectory and thinking, ooh, here is something rather different. It might be worth the detour and the deviation to go that way. Which again, of course, is something which when I was director of research, I always said to people, no, don't accept these invitations which pull you sideways, keep on the straight and narrow. So I'm a good example of not doing what I preached. So my own work is on relics in late antiquity and the early Middle Ages, and it has been for the last decade or more. I'm interested in the materiality of early medieval Christianity and the challenge of working across the textual material culture categories of evidence and how they do or don't sync or conflict. And I came across a very large corpus of the labels, which here you can see, these are all out of this box here. They're in a 9th century Caroline hand, which are tied round to identify what a piece of holy stuff is. These ones all name the saints that they come from. Some of them say, well, it's from the Holy Sepulchre or something like that. And I pulled together about 10 or more years ago a huge corpus of ones which have been published in very obscure places, but nobody had ever done anything with. And they have lots, and there, slightly off the edge of the screen, is a big sample of some of them. 500 or more predating the year 900. They're hugely varied in terms of their medium. Most of them are on parchment, but there's some on papyrus and some on textile, hugely varied in terms of their script, their ink, and so forth. And they've been entirely ignored. They come from absolutely everywhere. And Ira made the point to me very early doors that rather than her work, which has concentrated a lot on analysis of ink in medieval manuscript books, where you've got to painstakingly work from one folio to the next, because these documents are so small, you can analyze them and measure them much, much, much faster. And that's where having such a large sample set is a godsend. And one of the things they do, which you may even be able to see from the few that are here, is they challenge everything that you learn in, first level palaeography and diplomatic. They just don't do what early medieval scripts are supposed to do. So there are lots of reasons for working on them. We've got in the grant very clearly articulated aims, using them to study not the text, but the craft skills between writing, preparing parchment, and preparing ink. The text is ancillary, it's not totally irrelevant, but it's not the main focus, and that's why we call the project crafting documents. We're interested in understanding the techniques for making parchment, how those changed and why. We're interested in the various ways of making ink, how that changed, where and why. We're interested in whether relic cults play a role in transmitting and disseminating these craft skills. And then there is the subordinate question of whether all this knowledge gained from that adds to our understanding of saints' cults. And we're interested in seeing how far we can push this research to challenge standard models about the production of written documentation in the early Middle Ages. And of course, to bring to the world's attention this huge corpus of ignored material. Now, there are 4 very large collections of these early medieval relic labels, plus about another 20 which have got a handful in, which we're not at the moment dealing with, but these 4 large collections in Sens, of which about 50% are relevant. Shell, Merovingian and Carolingian royal nunnery, now housed in the Archives Nationales. The huge majority of that collection is pre about 800, 810. The collection from the Sancta Sanctorum, now in the Vatican Library, again, very, very heavily early medieval. And lastly, the collection from the Abbey of Saint-Maurice in the canton of Valais in French-speaking Switzerland, again, very heavily early medieval. So this gives us something over 400 relic labels, and we have already done a preliminary analysis of all of them, often working as a team. And I want now not so much to talk about the details of the work, because I'm going to leave that to Ira and Anna, but just to show you what some of the practical issues and fun and challenges of doing this work on site in these archives is. And we're going to start in Saint-Maurice at the foot of the Great St. Bernard Pass. It's the only way you can get from Gaul to Italy in the Roman world. It sits absolutely right there, controlling the pass. And here we are in the Sala Capitularis, which was originally built in the 17th century as the refectory but is now their chapter house. And this is Chanoine Roduit, who is our contact there. He's the monastic librarian, archivist, and for a while has been their deputy abbot. And he has been very good and very generous to us. It is quite an extraordinary place, right there under the bluff of the Alpine cliffs. And that has been cases of negotiating access very delicately with the monastic community, making sure that we don't enter their part of the premises, and working in, it was actually very cold when we were there in early October. We were considerably shivering. The next place we went to was Sens, where the cathedral treasury has this huge amount of material. The cathedral treasury is 2 rooms, originally separate, but now knocked together. One is the 14th treasury, which opens right off the apse of the cathedral, and it's been knocked through into this room where we're working, which was the Archbishop's private chapel in the Archiepiscopal Palace, and it's an early 17th century building. And this large tapestry is set up, and this cross is displayed where the altar was. So here we are in, again, an early 17th century room, working among the display cases, because the treasury is a museum that's open to the public. They set us up with portable trestle tables and very inadequate lighting. And it was quite a challenge, shall we say that? There's some more examples of us at work in these very difficult conditions, trying to make sure we didn't trip over each other's cables, and that this was the very, very, very first field trip we made, so we weren't quite sure how we worked together as a team, but we settled down, I think we'd say. And Anna and Ira will say rather more about what's going on in pictures like this. But Sens, the treasury at Sens, which was a freestanding institution, well, part of the church actually, was folded in about 20 years ago with the local civic museum and a very extensive collection of Gallo-Roman remains owned by the Société Archéologique de Sens. And between them, they have a little study centre set up. And a proportion of the relic labels, somewhere between about 1/3 and 1/2, have been transferred. And so we spent about half our time when we weren't in the treasury working here in rather better circumstances of their study centre in what's a rather nice original 18th century hôtel particulier. It was great fun. We had these big tables, lots of light, until the day on the table behind us, someone set up a printmaking workshop for wood block prints with jars of ink all over the place. And these people were blithely oblivious to us with these early medieval manuscript fragments in front of us, and they were pushing and jostling, and we were really, really quite worried about what was going on. And the woman in charge just threw up her hands and said, "C'est comme ça." Fortunately, we didn't get any ink or paint on any of our relic labels. But anyway, there we are at work in very, very different circumstances, facing very, very different sort of challenges. And the final sort of challenges that I want to show you, this was December, so this was about it's less than 2 months ago. The Archives Nationales, their new building, which I know that some of you have been to, in the outermost northernmost suburbs of France. This supposedly very stylish building. It's exactly 10 years old, and it's no longer working very well. And I am just so impressed with Ira's concentration as she was working away on her laptop. I don't know, Ira, can you see? There are 2 electricians above you trying to fix the lighting, because we're in a room. We're here talking to some of the conservators and curators. This is the main reading room. We were in a small seminar room opening off it that they put us where we could work without disturbing everybody else. So we arrived and set up shop, only to discover that as it got dark, there was no real lighting in the room. So we've worked in a variety of conditions, and always with the extraordinarily generous support and interest in our work from these institutions who have these tiny documents in their possession, which they really have done nothing with, don't know what they are, and nobody's ever really worked on them before. So it's really a great privilege. And overcoming obstacles like this, I think, is sort of all in a day's work. So that's all I want to say. So I'm going to hand straight over to Ira, if you can. So let's just move it on to your first slide. Ira, I'm failing to do it. Right, okay. So Ira, you just need to press the.
I think it was not the first. It's different. It's not the first. Actually, the first was the parchment.
No, that's what was sent.
Okay, I'm sorry. I seem to have sent the wrong one. Wrong presentation. And there were 2 slides on parchment for sure. No. I'm just looking at the back of it. That's strange. Well, I'm sorry. I'll have to speak with my hands and feet to explain what is missing. I think I sent the wrong presentation. Can happen. Well, first of all, I want to say I'm horribly sorry for this voice. I managed to contract cold. I was in Manchester, and probably all those people who are familiar with this wonderful city of Manchester will find that it is not quite surprising that I came out with a okay. Now, in the ink, the story of the ink was supposed to come after the story of the parchment, but I can use my feet and hands to explain parchment, which is, like, say, my passion since I think maybe shortly after I was born. You see, we all know how parchment is made. You take the skin, you dehair it, but before you dehair it, you throw it in lime solution. You remove the hair, you stretch it on a frame, you clean it, and you have a beautiful, bright, white writing material. However, it was not done always like that. And parchment did not appear actually in our time. The oldest parchment we know comes from 3rd century BC. And the majority of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which you might have heard, are written on parchment, but not on a very usual parchment. What we learn in the medieval studies, that parchment is never tanned. You just clean it, stretch it, it's white and flat, and no tanning solution ever touches it. That's why it's so white. However, in antiquity, especially in the Eastern antiquity, somewhere around Babylon, they were doing everything like that, but at the end, they were still tanning it. Okay, so in the beginning, we thought that this tanning story was kind of a transition from leather, which is tanned, parchment, which is never tanned. The studies of the Dead Sea Scrolls has shown that it is not the case. That in reality, there were 2 different types of parchment from the very beginning, the Eastern one and the Western one. And the Western one was, so to say, the predecessor of the one we know now. But at that time, they did not know that they need lime to dehair. They were taking all kinds of other minerals. Many of them, they were sulfates, different sulfates. Now, at certain point in the time, and we do not know this point in the time, and that's why this collection is so important, they started using lime. And we do not know when it was the oldest parchments that lime was used on them. We can, though, find it out when we study the parchment, okay? The Eastern type of parchment, the tanned one, basically disappeared. We still have some of it among Jews who produce it for the scrolls, but it's a very small number now, today. In the medieval times, they existed, not today. So today, the Eastern scrolls are made just on leather. So whatever is tanned today is leather. Whatever is not tanned and produced while stretched, dried under tension is parchment. Very simple. So going back to antiquity, we are desperately seeking the moment in time when it happened. And we want to know why it happened. You see, they were doing these skins for thousands of years, and always the tanning was involved in one way or another. Why wouldn't they? When they were starting doing parchment in the antiquity, to remove the hairs, they were just using the enzymes or beating it. One clear thing is, it was hot and it didn't last long. So we think, let's say, there is an indication that this new way of doing it evolved in the North, when they suddenly need a lot of writing material and there was not hot. Okay, so this is the story of the parchment. Now, we will also look at the animals. It's very interesting, yeah, because you know what in England was used. It was absolutely fantastically studied. Development of the domestication of the sheep and production of parchment was studied long before this new the new methods of DNA and proteomics were developed. In the 50s, in the 60s, people who studied leather were studying those skins before any of us was born, I think. Today with proteomics, it became easier. So again, it's interesting what we're doing in the South. And we think maybe after studying quite a large collection, we might have an indication how the different methods of production of parchment evolved or existed, and try to compare them. Okay? So far as the parchment, are there any questions about parchment? I'm sorry, the slides are not here. Any questions? No. Okay. Now we'll go over to the inks. The story of the inks is simpler if it works.
You need to use the mouse pad. There we go.
Okay, so very simple. We are studying, and what actually brought us together is the story of the inks and not the story of the parchment, because we are studying the history of inks. And it's very simple. In the antiquity, we have carbon ink. In the Middle Ages, we have iron gall inks. Why? How? When? Okay. Now, you can look on the side that we have any number of recipes of soot ink from antiquity, and especially interesting also in Greco-Roman period. If we go, what do I do now? Now, in Europe, you start getting these recipes of iron gall ink very late. The oldest European recipe is 12th or 13th century, depending on how you read the recipe, the first one. However, we know that those inks were in existence already in the first, second century of our time. So, in addition to the iron gall inks, there is something else. There are recipes that seems a bit strange for the antiquity. One of those recipes is by the Dr. Dioscurides, who suggested adding a metal, calcantum, something copper-based, to the ink, carbon ink with metal. And another recipe is even more interesting. It is a secret recipe from the 3rd century before the Common Era. And it says that if you write with a gallnut extract on the felt, you don't see the writing. But if you go with calcantum over it, it appears. Okay? So our thought was, okay, if it's a secret ink, so probably there was not a secret ink of this type that were already in use. What is important here, and what I want to attract your attention, is the presence of metals, right? The metals that we see here is not iron, it's copper. And it is clearly, when they say iron gall ink, it is probably has iron and not copper, right? So what do I do now? So this is, again, this is a speculation idea. It is well-based or not well-based. You can read whatever. There's a lot of written about this. So the idea was the following. In the antiquity, the production of carbon ink is complicated. It seems very simple. it is indeed very simple to have a minute amount. But if you need a big amount, a large amount of well-made carbon ink, you have a big problem. So the easiest way to produce an ink that looks like carbon, but is not carbon, is to adulterate it with whatever dark liquid. And the easier dark liquid that you can easily find is a tannin extract. It's brown, it's known, it's used for tanning, okay? Known everywhere. So from the other hand, when they started realizing and understanding that there is a reaction that produces something black, so this famous atramentum sutorium that we know from Plinium, this was the black of the shoemaker. This was the method of shoemakers, Greek shoemakers, but to blacken the leather. So we know from this that there was already a reaction known. However, it was not clear whether it was used for writing or was it really used only for blackening of the shoes. No. In any case, it is not very easy to make this reaction, and it is not very easy to produce a good chemical reaction that will produce very good ink. So probably the ink that they were producing at the beginning was not dark enough. So they would add a little bit of carbon. And again, you have black ink, right? So we find quite a big number of mixed inks that contain carbon on one hand, but also contain or tannins or already iron gold ink. So the first real recipe is in the 9th century. All our studies show that the ink was already there very long before. So one of the questions, where it started and how it is actually, how it won over basically the whole world, not Far East. In China and India, they have never heard about the production of iron gold inks until 20th century. Okay, so after all this beautiful introduction, may I just attract your attention that these different inks that I was speaking about have not just different colors, but they have different properties because they are chemically different materials. So on the left, you can see the carbon ink, which is dispersion ink. It is a dispersion of carbon pigment. Please don't fall asleep. It's another moment and I'll stop it. It is a dispersion of carbon pigments, okay? And you see their carbon pigment. You need something to glue this carbon pigment to your to the support, to the writing media, the writing material, and this is all. So it seems horribly easy to make. However, to produce charcoal or soot of high quality in big amount is very difficult. So now let us look at the tannin ink or extract of the tannins. The most important thing about it is that it is solution. It's just normal solution. It's a dye, okay? And our famous iron gold ink is something which is produced by a chemical reaction. And the chemical reaction is between soluble iron. So you need iron because only iron produces this black precipitate we call iron gold ink. But this iron can come in different types, okay? The most known one would be on the left. What you see there, it is called vitriol, and probably whoever worked with medieval studies and read at least one recipe had heard the word vitriol. Vitriol is a mineral. It is it's composed of different hydrated metal sulfates. Okay. Now, what you see there, and I don't know, I'm afraid to touch this, so I will go over. I think I shout so much that after that I'll lose my voice. So what you see here is this combination of all these vitriols that you find. What you see, they are all of different colors, right? And the most important ones are blue and green. And the iron one is green, the copper one is blue. And you can see that the difference between green and blue is very small. Until the 9th century of our time, no one actually knew that vitriol can be iron vitriol or copper vitriol. They were always thinking it was one and the same compound. Okay, so this probably indicates why the real recipe came so late. And until that time, this is all kind of this magic knowledge that was going from one place to another. But the really written recipe with the correct amounts comes indeed around 7th, 8th century, but not in Europe. It comes in the Middle East, and the Middle East we have hundreds of recipes of the iron gall ink. And only when we start reading there, take green vitriol, we understand that they know what they're talking about. They know already that they indeed need iron and not copper. But for many years, it was not known. Now, if you take whatever vitriol you take, copper vitriol, iron vitriol, you always have another one around it. So there's always a mixture. If there is enough iron vitriol in this mixture, you will get black ink. If there is not enough, you won't. Okay, another possibility to get iron gall ink is just to take nails and to throw them into acid. After some time, you get soluble iron without any vitriol. And this experiment you can make at home. Probably the modern nails are not very good because they are still, I don't know how long it takes to dissolve them, but it might be enough. And then you produce your ink. Okay, so we see already, first we didn't see any recipes, now we see that in addition to the lack of the recipes, we have completely different types of iron gall. Okay, this is all basically was done before we started working with Julia. Now, what do we do in our work? We go to the place where on the collection, and we study basically this inks, and we try first to get here it is imaging part. We are trying to get the type of the ink, and it is very important in those times with what ink would they be writing? With carbon ink, with plant ink, with iron gall ink. Already knowledge of the type of the ink is very indicative, because this is the time where it's all fluid. You have at the same time different type of the inks in different places. And then from the other type of the things we have on the top, you have 3 different X-ray fluorescence machines. X-ray fluorescence machines let us study the metals. And because this iron gall ink can be based on a vitriol, and vitriol has always different metals, we can always measure the relation of these metals to each other. And we can get by this something like a fingerprint of the ink. And then we can again compare them. Okay, I'm just running very quickly, and other methods. I unfortunately brought really completely wrong presentation. It was not what I was supposed to send here. But basically, I already explained everything we want to do and everything how we do this. I'm just looking at one of the things that we did in the very beginning. We have used a very small and simple microscope to identify the type of the inks, because the color of the ink doesn't necessarily tell you what type it is. And here, because those different types have different properties, plant ink become transparent, like dyes become transparent very early, in a very early in the sense of wavelengths. So they become transparent already at the beginning of the infrared region. Iron gall ink lose their opacity, only lose their opacity. They would become transparent at 1400 nanometers. 1400 nanometers is not an easy wavelength to produce and especially to detect. That's why we look only at the easily accessible wavelengths of 940 nanometers, which you can access with microscope, with your camera, with anything. And you see, if you look, you check whether this, whether the ink disappears or just changes its opacity, like in this picture. And of course, carbon ink stays forever black. So one of the simplest things that we also recommend to everybody who studies manuscripts is to check for the type of the ink. One of the important things is, for instance, in insular manuscripts that are written with a very black ink, very dark, and people were thinking actually that it was a mixed ink. In reality, it isn't. It was a very specific way of making iron gold ink here in this area. Okay, so I just leave this out because we don't have time. I sent mistake the different one. What I wanted to what I would like to show you here that the studies of the ink has shown this very different types, starting with 4th century before our time. So the oldest ink that has metal and has not just metal, but a type of process of iron gold ink is the ink that we found on a document in Elephantine from the 4th century BC. We would say this is probably the beginning of making of the new inks. It coincides with the time of Alexander. It coincides with a recipe of Philo of Alexandria from that time. So from that time on, people started to look for a new ink. Okay, and now you can see it took about 1,000 years to get to a good, solid, usable iron gold ink. And the one that you find already well made is 7th, 8th century of our time. And it is exactly the time we're going to work on this in this collection. Now, if you look at all these types of the inks we were looking at as the documents, they were always document either ancient Greek documents, Coptic documents, Hebrew documents. They're basically no European documents. We did some work on the European documents, and we have found that to the south of Alps, you see iron gold inks with vitriol, but not to the north. At least we didn't find until now. Now, there are iron gold ink, however, not made with vitriol. Whether it was difficult to get vitriol, or another possibility which we speculate on, it is they all started with plant ink. And then they started adding this metal until they got a very good black ink. So this project will help us to understand how the inks were produced in this period and how they were spread. I did have some parchment, but that was on the wrong side of the presentation. So this is just exactly what I was telling you.
That's one page you start with.
Yeah, can you bring it back? How it? I see now. I see.
Click on that.
I see now. Yeah, here, probably. Please.
There we go.
Yeah. So, okay, you don't need it anymore because it's exactly what I was telling without any pictures in the beginning.
And then if you move the cursor and click on the forward arrow, you'll go back to where you were.
I didn't need it, I just wanted to see. Yeah, right. This is something which, when you read whatever books about the Dead Sea Scrolls, you will find that half of them are people write. They're written on leather, they're written on parchment, they're written on parchment, they're written on leather. And it is because very often people do not understand the difference between these two materials. Okay, so should I stop now? Oh no, the time, I don't know, you are the director of the time. No, I'm just going back into just what I said in the very beginning. So we have two different materials for writing that we can look at in this place, in this collection. And we want to look how it was done. And here it is just a preparation of different types of writing material in antiquity, which usually is not taught in any course. Because this is all what we see here is a result of the studies of the Dead Sea Scrolls that were written on tanned parchment, okay? And what we want to see here is whether we are going to find some of them that are not. You said if I think. Okay, so now we would really want to see if we find this lime somewhere, because the first recipe for depilation with lime, for the use of lime in the 8th century of our time. But we were studying already some manuscript from the 5th century, basically Arabic manuscripts, and they were already done with lime. So we have many secrets and many questions to the materials, writing materials, and we hope to get some answers through the study of this material. Okay.
Thank you.
I'm sorry it came all with my cold and I had no time to look at this talk just before
I think,
this whole travel one.
Ira, we have got 1 or 2 slides of your work from the Sancta Sanctorum label right at the end of your presentation.
Yes, I mean, there was somewhere, thank you, so I thought, so this is a typical and the simplest way of looking at the ink. You see, this is a very dark ink. And in the first moment you would, so the upper 3 pictures is the picture of the ink in the UV light, in the visible light, and in a near infrared light. And you see that in the near infrared light, this very dark ink becomes basically invisible, which is an indication that we are dealing with iron gall ink. We still see it. It did not disappear completely. You certainly see the shadow, right? Everybody sees the shadow, so it's iron gall ink. Now we want to look at what kind of iron gall ink is this. And here, this picture shows us our analysis with X-ray fluorescence. It looks as where we're looking at it, at the letter. And on the right side, you see a spectrum that we get. And on the X-axis, you see the energy. And on the top here, you see the elements, chemical elements that we can find in this ink. And the red one is the spectrum of the parchment. And you see, X-rays, as everybody knows, passes easily organic matter. Otherwise, we wouldn't be going to X-ray us. And so when we do our analysis, we look at the parchment, we collect the composition of the parchment, and then we look at the ink. But we cannot look only at the ink. We always look at the ink and underlying parchment, right? Because it passes freely. And then to compare them, we need to have always these 2 spectra. And when we see here, we see that our parchment has a lot of calcium. So in these cases, it's indications that we already deal with lime. But what we see here is that the comparisons of the ink with parchment shows that we have a big amount of iron that appeared in the parchment when we went onto the ink. Okay? And iron, if you see, do you see it in the spectrum? Mm-hmm. So you see it here. But not only that, we don't see anything else. We see only clearly made iron gall ink, but it is not made with vitriol because we don't see any addition from vitriol. We don't see copper, we don't see zinc, we see only iron. If maybe another one was.
There's another one on the previous slide. That's slightly different.
Right.
This is also.
And on the top, you see quite easily that it's iron gall ink because it has almost disappeared. But on the spectra, in addition to iron, you see appearance of copper. So when you see iron and copper, it can come only from vitriol because in your normal nails, you don't have copper. Okay, so this is an easy and simple, very quick distinguishing. Now, there are some of those texts that see paleographically very similar. So we want to look at them with X-ray fluorescence, because if they are the same ink, we will have the same fingerprint. We will have exactly the same relation between iron and other metals. This is another step to check whether paleography can be, we can rely on the paleography saying that these labels were written in the same plate with the same ink. Okay, so now we can move all over. I mean, it was just hundreds of examples, but I thought cut and parchment is
Okay,
supposed to be.
let's see if I can operate this. Okay,
Horribly sorry for this mix-up.
there we are. Okay, so now it's my turn to say a few words about my contribution to the project. I promise to be brief because I know that wine awaits us and it's Friday afternoon. So, and also because Jose has to talk a little bit about his work as well. But as Julie mentioned earlier, I'm a medievalist based at Oxford, and together with Julia, we formed a team of historians who were thinking about the production and reception of these amazing relic labels. And by combining historical and scientific analytical methods, it is our aim to offer new insights into the development of writing technology in this key transitional period, as Ira was saying, key transitional period in Western culture, of course, to explore if and how these labels add to or challenge our knowledge about the materiality of writing in the period. But we also wish to think about or to inquire further into what the corpus can reveal about the materiality and the economy of early medieval Christianity and the saints' cults. So this is perhaps one of the bigger aims of the project. And believe it or not, this is the beard of Saint Peter. And that photo you saw before of me wearing a mask and handling something, looking slightly worried, that's what I was holding. So for crafting documents, I will be conducting a study of the handwriting preserved in these labels, these tiny labels, but not through a traditional standard paleographical approach. And this is partly due to the heterogeneity of the corpus, which would render a conventional paleographical analysis methodologically problematic, but also because intellectually we think that it wouldn't really help answer the questions that the project asks. And in fact, as Julie mentioned before, the labels have been catalogued, they've been transcribed. You'll find them in the Charta Latina Antiquaris. And they have also been the subject of a very thorough philological study and also paleographical classification by colleagues in Heidelberg, namely by our colleague Kirsten Wallenwein. So we propose to approach these labels through a very different lens. We have the history, we have science, and now I'm going to talk a little bit about the kind of questions I will ask. So I would like to approach these materials through a lens that can be perhaps best described as the human input. So scribal challenges, scribal practices, and also the attitudes towards the production of these relic labels. I will wish to, well, I am already thinking about the problems scribes faced when producing them. So problems relating to space constraints, quality of parchment, quality of inks, and to see if we observe any correlation between these elements and these features. What solutions scribes found or implemented to solve some clear problems that we can identify in several labels, and importantly, to think very carefully about where these labels sit in the wider panorama of the writing culture of the period, the writing production of this transition between late antiquity and the early Middle Ages. So these tiny documents have been generally characterized as examples of very informal writing without any calligraphic merit, produced simply to record what existed in these relic collections. Scruffy is always the word that comes to mind when I look at them, or most of them. But the reality is much more complex and also much more interesting, in my opinion. So while several labels were indeed produced by slightly clumsy scribes and are not the neatest of creations, to say the least, others tell a completely different story. And materially, we can see that several of these labels were made from parchment offcuts, which were likely sourced from the extremities of the stretched skin, which were, of course, much more difficult to scrape and therefore more gelatinous, more rigid, and much harder to work. And as a consequence, let me just show you here some examples. We have two versos and here a recto. As a consequence, they could also retain more hair follicles, which rendered the hair side unsuitable for writing, unless, of course, you were trying to produce a relic label. In that case, you could use it. But we also found offcuts at the opposite end of the spectrum. So bits of parchment that were so thin and so fragile that one couldn't do much with them either. This is in the collection of the Archives Nationales. It's a shell label. But it's in other cases, we find labels that were produced with great care using prime cuts that could have well been used in book production. And here we have some examples. And these examples in particular have raised quite important questions, as they are not, at first glance, parchment waste, not necessarily at least. So were scribes sourcing them from library books in their collections that were not that important? So they were repurposing parts of parchment. Were they buying parchment sheets on purpose for campaigns of relic curation? Or were they using offcuts or of better skins and trying as hard as possible to use the best remaining parts of the membrane? So all these hypotheses are plausible, but they're worth thinking about anyway. If we now turn to the scripts, Julia has shown us this slide already, but as you can see, we do see a range of approaches, but some specimens plainly contradict these generalized notions I just outlined, these ideas that they were just examples of second-rate writing. For instance, we have a significant enough number of specimens copied in majuscule forms, such as in uncial, and even this very late example of a label in rustic capitals, while others were written in minuscule bookhands, such as half uncial, and also some examples of post-Roman regional minuscules, as we see them here, which were used in the copying of manuscripts. So these are clearly bookhands and by very accomplished scribes, because I keep saying they're tiny and only a very good scribe could produce such beautiful handwriting. So this means that a proportion of labels, even if not the majority, were written in script types that stood at the very top of the hierarchy of scripts in the early Middle Ages, and which were correspondingly the most technically challenging, parchment and time-consuming scripts. And that's why they were generally reserved for the copying of higher status books. And these different graphic approaches may well reflect regional practices and preferences, which is also something we are going to explore. But a few labels do offer important glimpses into the work of the scribe, the person behind the label, as it were, and how there might have been a degree of agency in some cases. So in other words, that the choice of script may have been sometimes meaningful. And this becomes quite apparent when things don't go according to plan. And I just love this label because we can see here, Hic sunt reliquias Sancti Leodegario, that the scribe started with a type of script much bolder, bigger, and then he realized that probably he wouldn't have enough space to continue like that. And all of a sudden, the writing becomes more rushed. We have more ligatures, especially in the part of the name of the saint. But not just the choice of script, but also the care that some craftsmen put into the creation of these labels is important to consider. It was remarkable to see how some of these tiny etiquettes were meticulously measured, and the text was laid out with great graphic and spatial precision. And we go back to the shell examples. This one, the one at the bottom is not shell, it's in a collection of Saint Maurice, but not quite possibly from the same region of production. So, as I said, meticulously prepared in good parchment, and the mise en etiquette, as it were, is also really, really precise. So I guess that by exploring scribal attitudes to the production of these labels as far as possible, of course, will be hugely important to come to a closer understanding of how they perceived, how they were perceived, these documents were perceived in the period. And the million-dollar question, I guess, at least the question that keeps me awake at night already, is, were they simply some sort of managerial records, or was there more to them? And to help us obtain a much clearer picture of all the possible relations between labels, saints, inks, parchment, regions, and so on, our colleague, Jose, who is a historian himself, has designed this wonderful database to help us keep track of everything. So I will now hand over to Jose. Thank you.
I'm just gonna keep this here. Okay. Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Julia, for inviting me to inviting me back away, because but I'm happy to be here after a whole day of tutorials on the papacy against secular rulers from Gregory VII to Boniface VIII. So, and I didn't have one in the tutorials, and this is certainly better. The part that I'm going to present is very short, in fact, but it's just talking a bit about the database and perhaps the more kind of digital humanities aspects of the project. The idea of the database, or why have a database, is not just for displaying the data, but it's mainly in terms of organizing analysis and storage of the data for the long term. So when you're dealing with large numbers of data, I'll just move to the,
you need to just click on the yeah, there you go.
Yeah, when you're working with large corpus of data, and I have to remark that, you know, the data that this project is going to produce is large, but it's very small in comparison with, you know, if you're people like software engineers that work with databases, they will say, well, this is a miniature database, and from this perspective it is, but for us is kind of quite large in and of itself, because not only we're working with hundreds of labels, but there's lots of aspects regarding the palaeographic, ink, parchment analysis, and other things like, you know, which saints are being named, how many objects are being referred to, et cetera, all of it information that can be useful in producing insights into this culture. So yeah, so database is an ideal tool to organize all this material, enhance the findings. And before I explain what the database is and how it works very briefly, I think it's important to remark on the long-term vision of, you know, from the digital humanities perspective. The University of Oxford, like many other institutions, have realized that it is important to preserve the data that projects like this produce, not just because it's nice to keep it, but because it can actually be reused by other scholars in the future. So, you know, there's lots of funding going into a project, and then if the data is lost, then, you know, it feels like part of the work has been lost to the generations to come. So the University of Oxford has a new platform called, in the humanities division, called SDS, or Sustainable Digital Scholarship, and this is quite new, but their goal is basically to make sure that all the data produced by projects here at the university, the humanities divisions, is preserved in the long term. They use their own platform, which is called Fixture. For those interested, it's not a relational database. So one of the things they told us from the beginning is that we have to give them the data in the kind of simplest format possible, which, if you know what it means CSV files. So, you know, just comma-separated values, which is what you have if you take an Excel and you export it in its kind of simplest version. Now, with that, they are going to build, you know, their own database, so to speak, within their system. And they can manipulate it into a platform. So what will happen at the end of the active life of the project, so to speak, is that you'll have something similar to what already exists for the Cults of Saints and Antiquity database, in addition to the database that we are going to produce. And I'll explain in a second why we're producing a database in addition to what SDS is going to do with Fixture. But it will look something like that. You'll have different ways of searching and filtering through the database. And most importantly, all the data will be there as well. So it will be able to download the data sets, including also things like some of the images that Ira and Oliver are going to produce at BAN. So some of them will also be there. So the ones that we are using to analyze some of these aspects of ink and parchment. Now, initially, we thought of creating, well, if what they want is CSV values, then we'll just create Excel tables and that's it. But very quickly, you realize that it's very difficult to organize efficiently without lots of repetition of the information if you use an Excel. So initially, we started just with a very big kind of Excel table with lots of categories and things. But then the moment, you know, we realized it was going to be too much, we decided to go for a simple relational database of Access, which is part of the Office platform. And that way, it makes so much easier to capture the information in an organized way, and then you can export it in CSV files. And you know, at the end of the day, the result will be the same, but it just facilitates capturing the information in an intelligent way. So, yeah, distinguishing also between different labels, inscriptions, ink points, bibliography as well, which we have included, dates and saint names, and all sorts of information that will be included. So yeah, I mean, we basically have more structured database with kind of different tables. And the advantage of this is that we'll also be able to create reports. So people will be able at the end also to download the file of the database itself that we have created and create reports when you can have like different information that you want to select and print it in sort of PDF format. I mean, many of the heavier files will be stored in the system. They will be connected with the database using variable paths. And then the team in Berlin has their own storage system because their own institution, the BAN, has their own requisites. And it's likely that not all the data that they're going to produce is going to be transferred to us because it will be lots and lots of data. So, you know, there's also different requirements for both sides of the project. Therefore, the way of storing and preserving information is different. Then finally, the advantage of using the database is that you have the ability to connect your database with other databases. So in this case, when we had the workshop with Kirsten, this colleague of ours from Heidelberg, who has worked on the same sets, one of the things that we could quickly figure out is that because of all the work that she has done, and she is developing her own database with other information about many of these labels, that we can use the primary keys to connect both databases so that people who are using our database, they can directly access the information in HAS, which is complementary. So that's another advantage. And then, well, I would just like to end with a cautionary note. And I know this is going to sound strange coming from someone who's spent some time working on this and in other projects of digital humanities. But I was talking some months ago with Venus Stein, who did the wonderful project of Isidorus and you know, all the manuscripts of Isidorus, and there's a database online that you can check. I don't remember what's the name of the etymologies, something on the etymologies of Isidorus. And she had been tracking all the small digital humanities projects and manuscripts, and she told me that about 80% of them died within 6 years, which means they disappear, they vanish, all the information. Now, the problem is that many institutions do not have something like SDS. The second problem is that funding runs out and these things require keeping. And if there's no funding, it's not keeping. That's the second problem. But there is all sorts of other problems. And I think I just can point to the British Library recent. So just, as a note of caution, like with adopting any new technologies, I think we should be cautious. And one of the things I remarked to Julia one and again is that whatever the output, digital output that we produce with this project, let's make sure that we print it and leave a copy in Alsace Library, not in the bottom. Because if we're working with documents that are hundreds of years old and they're still there for us to work with, I think that should be a wake-up call. But again, I'm not discouraging anyone from using digital tools or digital humanities, but I think we should keep this kind of hybrid approach for the time being. It's still very young technology. And that's all. If anyone has any questions or later on. Yeah, thank you.
And I just would like to add that this is the address to our website. So please do visit. We have some resources there for whoever is interested in the history of the cult of saints and also in the scientific study of manuscripts. I won't try to open it by clicking that because it was difficult enough to set everything up. So I'll just leave it like that, and do follow us on X, Twitter, if you are around. Thank you very, very much.